Here is the review for the 1970s to 1980s presentation topics. We'll first start off with the atomic energy group, and you should recognize some of the images from the 50s and 60s presentations. In this image, we see once again the role of water and how it is used to control the rods as far as cooling them down. Here we see a map of locations of nuclear power plants throughout the United States. And the reason why there's none here possibly is a result of what happens at 3 Mile Island when there was a potential nuclear disaster that led to Congress and the national mood turning away from nuclear energy. So you definitely want to make sure that you focus on that issue. Here we see an image of 3 Mile Island, and it's a result of this event that led to less approval for nuclear power plants. During the Cold War, we talked about nuclear missiles, and we see one of these underground nuclear missile silos that exists. And oddly enough, they have been up for sale and being used for converted homes. And here we see one being posted on Airbnb. Definitely very odd. For suburban growth, as we transition to the next topic, we see some of those stores, Rickles, Blockbuster, and Sears. And we talked a lot about the central business district and how people were able to move out of the cities into the suburbs did. And that was an image we looked at in the 1920s as well as in the 1950s. And these suburbs are not going to be successful unless they have stores, which is why you start to see suburban stores develop. Here we see an article from the South Brunswick Post looking at the proposed annex to South Brunswick, which means that the student population is starting to increase. And here we see another article that's talking about the student increase with regard to the needs in the cafeteria. So at the end, we see South Brunswick developing as a suburb. As we move into the television group, these shows right here are all shows from the 1970s. This one Day at a Time, was about a divorced mother, which was odd considering in the 1970s. And it was definitely a reflection on the changing attitudes towards marriage. All in Family was a show about left versus right in a family competing during discussions, and that really seemed to be the premise of that show. Happy Days was a show about the 50s, although it aired in the 1970s. By the time we get to the 80s, you start to see some of that reflected in the shows. For example, Family Ties was about the baby boomer trying to raise Gen X and the difficulties that that presented. Another show from the 80s, which was about life in the 60s. And these shows were about trying to uphold some of those traditional family values while marriage was headed down and divorce was headed up. As we look at some of the other shows, 83 million people watching the ending of the show MASH. Definitely different when you consider online streaming. So, this is something that you definitely want to focus on. As we transition into Carter and Reagan, we start off the 70s with Nixon as president, but as a result of Watergate, Nixon winds up resigning, and then Gerald Ford winds up taking place of the president, replaces him, and actually winds up pardoning Nixon after all of the wrongs that Nixon may or may not have done. We get into the 1976 election where we see Ford with the Republicans running, but then Jimmy Carter winds up taking on the presidency. And the Carter administration was definitely plagued with some economic issues and a crisis of confidence with the Iranian hostage crisis. And we start to see the 1970s associated with inflation. And that basically means that the cost of items that were $1, maybe now they're costing $3. And that's a result of the inflation that's causing the prices to increase. For example, we could look at oil. Oil was reduced by an organization called OPEC that was concerned about the Arab Israeli issue. And they basically cut back production, which led to a shortage and then led to longer gas lines. Also, the Americans, used to those four-cylinder engines, are not used to the four-cylinder engines, used to the eight-cylinder engines, and the eight-cylinder engine needing a little bit more fuel in order to run. Here we see the election with Carter and Reagan going back to the Republicans. There's an argument to be made that the conservative movement was upset about some of the issues in the 1960s, that the left was too out of control. The religious right eventually would attach itself to the Republican Party, considering issues like Roe v. Wade, which again is about the family and that family headed for divorce, which is part of the reason why people believe that Reagan was voted into the White House, simply because of the role of the Christian right. And Reagan's presidency, as all presidents encounter, issues with the economy, global issues, but Reagan is usually associated with Reaganomics, which means we get money from the government, give it to corporations, and then those corporations, through jobs, get it to the people. This is a direct opposite of the idea that government gets money to the hands of the people, and then the people spend it, and then that spending would actually spur business production. Reaganomics was about giving it to corporations and having the corporations distribute that money. Poverty definitely a part of the 1970s as well as the 1980s. On this slide, we see the drug epidemic that's starting to impact America with the rise of crack cocaine. In the 1970s, cocaine was the drug that possibly would be one that one would want to use. But the problem with cocaine is that it costs too much money. And before you know it, people were able to figure out a way to use cocaine and make crack, which gave you the same feeling of using Coke. But the problem now was that it was at a reduced rate of like $3 because it was just cheaper, but you could still get the same high. And that led to this situation where people were just using crack cocaine, and it led to the war on drugs. Gay rights group. Here we see the Psychiatric Association, which classified homosexuality as a mental disorder. Barbara Giddings, Frank Cometti, and Dr. Fryer. Here they are at the Psychiatric Association challenging that logic. We also start to see transgender activists coming forward as a result of treatment. The gay rights movement, which was primarily about gay men, didn't really focus on transgender issues, and that's what made the organization STAR significant. Um, the gay rights group would also become militant with groups like the Gay Liberation Front. Here we see the Gay Manifesto, where I guess people within the gay rights movement were just frustrated, feeling that their concerns were not being met. And then they kind of went to the right, very similar to like King, where people felt that in the early 60s, nonviolent was too passive, not getting anything done. And people went to the right and aligned themselves with groups like Malcolm X and the Black Panther Party. Another organization called the Gay Activists Alliance, which used ZAP as a form of protest. And basically, what they were trying to do was just embarrass politicians. An example of a ZAP would be what was done to Anita Bryant, where they pied her in the face. And by the time we get into the 80s, 90s, it really doesn't have any LGBTQ inclusion in schools, and that trend starts to change with an organization called GLSEN that starts to promote this study that looks at public school as the most hostile environment for homosexuals. And that's what's in this particular study right here. So feel free to look that up. Also wanted to take note that in the 1980s, the primarily gay men were accused of spreading AIDS and seemed to be killing gay men in great numbers, which led to the AIDS crisis. And once again, the gay rights groups needed to protest, but now they have another issue, and that issue was the AIDS epidemic. We then transition to the generation group. Here we're looking at these four generations and some of the things that are going on where you're able to learn dance moves and music from a show like Soul Train. The 1970s, baby boomers and Gen X, depending on your age within those generations. Saturday Night Fever was definitely a popular film about disco music. Here we see the Bugles, and we see the introduction of something like cable television, which then led to the need to have videos, and videos needed to factor in the actual image of the artist. 1980s, associated with glam rock, it's a genre of rock music. Michael Jackson put out the Thriller video, and that aired on MTV. I want to say hourly. Madonna challenged gender norms with some of her music. For example, in Papa Don't Preach, it's about her being pregnant, and it definitely seemed to capture the mood of the times in the 80s. And then by the time we get to the 90s, you see this reflected in some of the music. And again, divorce rates are going up, and this is having an impact on families because in the 1950s, we looked at the nuclear family, man, woman, two children, and dad could work. But by the time we get into the 1980s, mom and dad have to work or mom and dad are divorced. And this winds up destroying the family. And you start to see the term latchkey kids. And a latchkey kid was a kid who comes home and basically takes care of himself. And you see this in some of the music where people start to become a little more isolated. Computer group, we talk about the first video game system, Pong, and how video game manufacturers were working to try to make computers. And it wasn't until Apple wind up putting out their Macintosh in 1984, which went mainstream by providing a service through a computer that allowed people to actually see the potential of this particular new invention. Don't forget about the ARPANET in the 1970s when they were starting to organize computers into some sort of database. Here we see the schematic of the ARPANET for the 1970s. Data was saved on floppy disk. You'll probably laugh at the amount of storage you can get from one of these disks. And if you wanted to communicate, you could communicate through something called a CB radio, where you can plug this into your car antenna and then use it as a way to communicate. It's kind of like the 1970s version of a chat room. And if you wanted to organize information, you could possibly get an encyclopedia. These were a volume of books, each book with a letter, and that would give you all of the information for like A, you would see aardvark. Computers would also lead to the evolution of hackers through the Hacker Manifesto, which is outlined here. Then we transition into terrorism, which definitely has a 1970s golden age for this particular group. Here we see the explosion of Pan Am Flight 103 over Lockerbie, Scotland. There were definitely a lot of planes that were skyjacked in the 1970s. And we're trying to point out that prior to 9/11, planes were skyjacked or hijacked or blown up for various reasons. And none of these reasons, targeting the United States anyway, dealt with anything related to Islam. For example, Holder and Kirkhow, their issue was about the Vietnam War. Tai Bin was about the Vietnam War. The Unabomber was a terrorist in the United States, and all of these had nothing to do with Islam. Now, the Achille Lauro was this cruise ship that was hijacked over the Arab-Israeli issue, and most terrorism in the United States going into the 90s seemed to be about the issue of abortion, as well as waging war on the federal government through acts like the Oklahoma City bombing. And you want to outline some of those, specific attacks and how they varied the strategies. Going back to cars, the debate about small versus big cars, the four-cylinder versus the eight-cylinder engine, and as a result of OPEC and the oil shortage, those four-cylinder engines that were common in the 1920s, that 1960s eight-cylinder engine, before you know it, cars were starting to be made with four cylinders, or they were given a catalytic converter, which led to less pollution. The abortion group, we spent time looking at the Comstock laws and the evolution of abortion, the abortion committees in the 1950s, and then by the time you get to the 1970s, Roe v. Wade, which allows abortion by the federal government, led to a situation where people felt that women were not getting married and marriage was declining, yet abortion was up. And these are two examples that the right would use to talk about getting back to family values, using abortion as a topic that would potentially be problematic. And you see a lot of doctors being killed and abortion clinics being targeted in the name of abortion. We also have a franchise group that has to talk about the role of scientific management, which takes us back to the 1920s, and how franchises like Domino's, McDonald's used specific strategies to outperform their competitors. And you should be referencing some of the things in the 1920s. The group class in America, we should be looking at what's happening throughout the decades with regard to wages. And the key thing that you want to focus on here is in the 1940s, World War II is providing a lot of jobs. Wages are high, unions are a go. By the time you get to the 1970s, you start to see the economy experiencing inflation. The 1980s with those trickle-down economics, and then the 1990s economy being saved as a result of the dot-com bubble. You could also make connections to COVID. Just really want to focus on the economy. Here we see an example of some of the poverty as a result of some of the events going on in the South Bronx. The South Bronx became a national image of poverty in the United States as a result of the policy called benign neglect that basically said we are not going to deal with the race problem and we're not going to try to solve poverty. We see no connection. And these are images from the South Bronx in the United States in the 1970s. You could also look up Cabrini Green, Skid Row, to try to make a connection to poverty and racial discrimination there. Terrorism in 9/11 is a little different because it's not just looking at terrorism, it's looking at terrorism and 9/11. Ramzi Youssef committing the first Trade Center attack before Al Qaeda existed. Here we see some of the key figures of Al Qaeda. Notice that they all were participating in the Soviet Afghan War. Ramzi Youssef parked the van at the Trade Center in '93 and tried to blow up the building, and that was before Al Qaeda existed. By the time you get to 1998, you start to see bin Laden write his '98 fatwa, which inspired people to attack, or Al Qaeda to attack the U.S. embassies in Africa. Here, bin Laden would outline his ideas and eventually, try to blow up the USS Cole, which was in Yemen. And before that, you start to see Al Qaeda on the rise, starting to people buying into bin Laden's interpretation of Islam before the 9/11 attacks. We also have a group on hip hop and disco that should focus on benign neglect, the poverty in the 1970s, the cutting of programs that led to people like Kool Herc, Africa Bambaataa starting to take records, mix them together, focus on the breaks, the beats, and this led to a cultural evolution of hip hop. Um, these are all things that you should probably be focusing on. You also have to address the genre of punk music, and there's a link between punk and hip hop as a result of some of those people coming together to kind of appreciate their own culture. And you should also be analyzing the lyrics like YMCA, Night Fever, especially YMCA for some of the gay rights references that are being made in there, which is what made disco such a popular genre of music in the 1970s, which is why the film Saturday Night Fever is significant because, it kind of brought disco to mainstream America.